and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the head of an international humanitarian effort underway to alleviate the suffering of the Cuban people, whose country is falling apart all around them as they run out of food, water, gas, and electricity, while garbage piles up and cars and motorcycles are abandoned on the side of the roads. Joining us from Mexico City is David Adler, General Coordinator of the Progressive International, who previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his campaign for U.S. President, Policy Director of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, and the co-founder of the Green New Deal for Europe campaign. He recently helped organize the global summit Flotilla to Gaza, leading to his arrest and detention in a prison camp in the Negev Desert by Israel. He is now organizing the Nuestra America convoy to Cuba, an international coalition delivering humanitarian aid by air, land, and sea to Havana, Cuba, on this coming Saturday, March the 21st. Then we'll explore possible scenarios to end the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, as well as the likelihood the war will escalate after Israeli strikes on a major Iranian gas field that could lead to reciprocal attacks against vulnerable Saudi, Qatari, and other Gulf oil and gas terminals and storage facilities, resulting in windfalls for the remaining oil producers, the U.S. and Russia, and energy crises for China, Japan, South Korea, and Europe, along with everyone else. Joining us is Stephen Simon, who served on the National Security Council staff as Senior Director for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs, and also worked on the NSC staff on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. Currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a Distinguished Fellow at the Davidson Institute for Global Security and Professor of Political Science at Dartmouth College. He is the co-author, among other books, of The Age of Sacred Terror, and his latest book is Grand Delusion: The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. He has an article at Responsible Statecraft. We will discuss, like Iraq, key intelligence before Iran strikes was ignored, as well as at War on the Rocks, drinking from the bitter chalice in the Middle East again. And before we begin, with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump cacistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power, as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now from Mexico City is David Adler, who is the General Coordinator of the Progressive International, who previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his campaign for U.S. President. He is now organizing the Nuestra America convoy to Cuba, an international coalition delivering humanitarian aid by air, land, and sea to Havana, Cuba, on March the 21st. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Adler.
Thank you so much for having me, Ian. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you, David. And obviously, it's been said that the first casualty in war is truth, but it also would seem that the first casualty in war are innocent civilians, and we are in the process of bombing Iranians in order to liberate them. And we're also in the process, it appears, of starving Cubans in order to liberate them. So you have come up with something that's actually necessary and workable. So tell us about what you expect to arrive in Cuba on Saturday.
The Nuestra America convoy has brought together, delegations from over 30 countries, 300 organizations, among them, parties, unions, movements around the world, who are outraged, horrified by the senseless policy of siege against the island of Cuba. But we're not sort of naive about the scale of the humanitarian cost and the aid that would be required to redress that cost. So we're, immensely pleased, honored, delighted, grateful for the outpouring of kind of grassroots support for this delegation, which includes, over 20 tons of humanitarian aid. We're talking about cancer medicines, cold chain medicines that we're flying over on charters. We're talking about solar panels to power hospitals and clinics, menstrual kits for women and girls, um, food, a wide range of humanitarian aid that is really not available to the people of Cuba as a result of, not just the commercial embargo or the financial sanctions, but now this naval blockade that has all but sealed off the Cuban economy from the world, aggravating a humanitarian crisis and inducing conditions of kind of famine and starvation and sickness that will inevitably result in scores of deaths of the elderly, the sick, of newborns, and even their mothers in maternity wards that don't have any power to keep them running.
And you're in Mexico City, and the Trump administration have pressured the Mexican government not to send oil, along with Venezuela as well, to Cuba, which has brought about this crisis where the grid has crashed. Cars and motorcycles are abandoned on the side of the road, having run out of gas. Just in practical terms, David, how do you fly stuff in when you can't get any jet fuel to fly the planes out? So that means that they're not fully loaded.
So most of the airlines have been forced to stop servicing the island, both because of fears around these commercial sanctions and retribution, retaliation from the Trump administration, but also, as you say, because long-haul flights are just not possible when refueling in Cuba is not doesn't correspond with the actual needs and access to fuel on the island. I mean, not a drop of fuel has reached the island now, approaching 3 months. And I don't think there's a single society on Earth that in 2026 could survive without access to fuel, and which not powers everything from water cleaning and treatment plants all the way to cancer patient treatment. So what's still running though, luckily, are these shorter haul flights. So from Panama, from Cancun, from Miami, there are planes that are running and can be chartered. Where fuel from outside the country can be used to make these deliveries, and that's been part of the kind of brave stand that Mexico has taken under the leadership of its president Claudia Sheinbaum to say, okay, we've been bullied away from these regular sovereign commercial shipments of oil through our national oil company Pemex to Cuba, which we shouldn't just pretend is business as usual. This is a grave violation of international law and the integrity of the international commercial system. Not that Donald Trump has any compunction about such things, but Mexico has made sure to communicate that its airports are available for any airline, any country, any mission that would need to use them to refuel en route to Cuba to be able to, participate in humanitarian missions like ours.
So are other countries, they're all being bullied, I'm sure, but Canada, of course, we know that Trump said he wants to make Canada the 51st state, and he's been incredibly aggressive and insulting towards Prime Minister Carney. My understanding is that the Cubans have a lot of affection for the Canadians because they've been good friends. Can you organize other countries, or is Trump basically, he recently said that he's granted himself, quote, the honor of taking Cuba. So is he stopping these countries from who would want to help to mitigate this humanitarian crisis in Cuba? Is he preventing this from happening, and therefore you're filling the gap?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people, don't maybe understand the nature of our sanctions policies just generally, irrespective of Cuba. Usually the way that the United States conducts this form of economic warfare is we conduct primary sanctions, that is on individuals or on governments or even on entire economies. but we also oversee sort of secondary sanctions. So if you dare, from a third party perspective, whether that's a company or a country, to engage in commerce or financial transactions with a sanctioned entity, then we go after you and through secondary sanctions. And that's not just a Trump policy. One of the largest fines that the U.S. government gave out, under Democratic presidencies was even under Obama, who's famous for having thawed relations with Cuba, fining some huge sum, millions and millions and millions of euros, BNP Paribas, out of Europe for conducting financial transactions with Cuba, again, on completely independent sovereign terms, right? So the siege has this secondary sanctions logic. The idea was not just to set up a naval blockade, but to threaten sanctions and tariffs against any country that would dare to break that blockade, dare to provide that energy to Cuba on their own sovereign terms, or and to confiscate even their private property. These are people who supposedly want to stand up for property rights in Cuba, but then if you dare to approach the island carrying petroleum or gas to service their economy, they'll confiscate your private property. So it's not just Venezuela and Mexico that have been discouraged from sending petroleum. Also countries like Brazil and Colombia, which have huge reserves of petroleum that, because they're in election years, have their own anxieties about U.S. intervention. They saw what's happened in places like Argentina and Honduras and even New Mexico, and are extremely nervous and cautious about entering into direct confrontation with the Trump administration that seem determined to reassert dominance in the Western Hemisphere, if not, as you point out, outright call for its recolonization.
So I understand this situation is so dire on the island with no electricity. Any building that has 2 or 3 stories or more, they use electric pumps to pump the water up to the top floors, and then gravity takes it down. That means that you don't have water. Whatever food you have is in the refrigerator has already been spoiled. Garbage is piling up in the streets. There's nobody to collect it. There's no gas for the garbage trucks. Vehicles are abandoned on the side of the road. My understanding is that within weeks, the whole country could grind to a halt. So what is happening in terms of back-channel negotiations, do you think, or do you have any knowledge of what's going on with negotiations that apparently Secretary of State Rubio's involved with talking to Raul Castro's grandson, Colonel Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro. Mm-hmm. And apparently he, of course, has a somewhat notorious jet-setting lifestyle, and he's the kind of guy they think they can make a deal with. So do you think that they're going to end up making a deal in the way that they made a deal in Venezuela, kept the government in place and deal with whoever is willing to play ball? Because Rodriguez Castro, his father set up GAISA, which is the economic basic powerhouse that is Cuban capitalism, in spite of its communist revolution, and it basically controls the economy, has all the money, takes care of themselves, but not necessarily the people. So this is a pretty grim situation, as far as I can tell. There aren't any really good guys in this.
Well, okay, let's back up a bit. Lots of things on the table there. So the first is that one never should count out the resilience and the creative resistance of the Cuban people. They've been accelerating on a transition to renewable energy and installing solar panels everywhere the eye can see as a way of basically circumventing the naval blockade, the siege of the island that's been established by the Trump administration. So, they've been very clear about their intentions to hold on, to resist and to engage the U.S. in negotiations, as has always been their position. So let's come to the negotiations. Now, there's many things frustrating about the presentation of these so-called negotiations in the U.S. American press in particular. One aspect is the idea that the U.S. is somehow pressuring the Cubans to come to the table. For decades, the Cubans have said, we would love to make a deal. And in fact, under the Obama administration, less than 10 years ago, they had a deal. It was Trump that threw away that deal, just as he ripped up the JCPOA in the Iranian case, right? This is a guy who pretends as if they're starting this bilateral relationship from scratch. Cubans have long said, let's sit down, let's talk about the conditions under which we can engage bilaterally and under which, we can invite more investment in the island that it so desperately needs. It's the U.S. that has been determined to block those negotiations, to strangle the island, to asphyxiate its economy. And so every time we hear, oh, the Cubans are coming to the table, it has to be read with a pinch of salt because the implication on the back end is that they weren't ready to come to the table before. When in fact, there are really no substantive negotiations going on. Most of the things you see in the US press are leaks, and they're mostly used as smokescreens, just as Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Geneva meeting with the Iranians was a smokescreen while the U.S. was preparing a bombardment of Tehran. So we don't see strong reasons to believe that Marco Rubio is serious about these negotiations, that they're ongoing. All we know is that there's been some chatter, some messages have been exchanged. There was one very minor meeting on the sidelines of the CARICOM conference recently. These are not serious negotiations. We will know when they are underway, and we will know in what they consist. And the danger of overstating their importance is that what the U.S. likes to do, and they did it in Venezuela, and they did it with Iran, is they make outrageous demands, such as your head of state must flee the country, the Castros must leave, or whatever it is. No sovereign country in their right mind would just accede to these demands imposed through a series of kind of imperial aggressions by a foreign country, much less Cuba. And set the conditions from the U.S. side for them saying, well, the Cubans walked away from the negotiating table. Now our only choice is to use force. And the tragic irony of that is that, the U.S. Cuba policy pursued by Marco Rubio and President Trump is extremely unpopular. 3% of U.S. Americans believe the U.S. should use force to do something about the Cuban government. No one supports the effort to take it over, to annex the island. Most U.S. Americans, a large plurality, think that Cubans should decide their government for themselves, that we have no business conducting neither regime change nor diplomatic pressure to, force these kinds of economic reforms. So I think, the principal anxiety that we have now is that there's something cooked up by Delta Force or in the darkest hole of the Pentagon and Fort Bragg that could involve, the so-called Venezuela playbook, which is raining bombs on the capital and asserting kind of our control over the country in one way or the other, which, aside from what outcome it may result would be, a travesty and a new precedent-setting sort of exercise in the violation of international law.
Well, we can pray that they're not that stupid, but I'm afraid there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that they are, and that this administration is really driven largely by greed. And you organized a convoy into Gaza. So what's Gaza about in terms of Trump and Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff? It's a real estate opportunity, right? Beachfront property.
Yeah.
So isn't that that's what I expect, is that these guys are motivated, thinking they're going to make a ton of money out of taking over hotels in Cuba, as opposed to taking care of the people. You're trying to take care of the people. That should be the focus.
So, I think it's helpful always to disaggregate and to make distinctions between different parts of the Trump coalition, the Trump 2 coalition. And the way I usually explain it with the reference to Cuba is that there's kind of three main groups that are competing for the attention of the president and for control over his foreign policy perspective. The first is, as you mentioned, the kind of New York, Manhattan set. Those are real estate developers, business people, the Witkoff, Kushner set. Those people do think in dollars and cents, and they're the ones who develop things like, the Gaza Riviera proposal, and they can be enticed with questions of money. The second set is what we might call like the sort of the Pete Hegseth, Langley, raw American power set. They're interested in exercising U.S. supremacy and establishing kind of our might, seeing it across the world. We like using our weapons. We're going to use them. We're going to show our hard force. The third set that's really important here is the kind of sort of Florida, Cuban American, but Florida set, which is a kind of Cold War anti-communist crusader set. They don't really care how we do this. They're not interested in showing off an F-35. They just want to squeeze the hemisphere out of the away from socialism and into a more market reformed free market capitalism. And all three of those groups can either contest and compete or coordinate to kind of push a common view of what Trump should do. And what I think is happening now in the White House, especially as the administration is so overextended in the Middle East, is that there's a lot of confusion in the kind of contradictions and cracks between those three groups about what could and should be done. And there's a more maximalist view of regime change and how that gets done, and there's a more minimalist view of let's do business, let's take over parts of the island in the name of U.S. American capitalism. But I think the idea that the Cubans are not ready to sort of encourage U.S. business investment is just crazy. I mean, if you walk down the Malecon now, you'll see gleaming new hotels, mostly from Spanish capital that's come and invested in the island and brought much needed resource in the context of the U.S. sanctions and commercial embargo. So It's very difficult to see how this resolves. Um, I'm more hopeful by the day that the humanitarian crisis that we have not just aggravated but initiated on the island is going to reach more and more U.S. American ears and eyes and become scandalous. We can really move public opinion. That's the goal, secondary goal, I should say, of the North America convoy that I'm helping to lead. And I'm also confident that right now there's a meeting of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, in Colombia under Gustavo Petro's leadership, and I've been part of a lot of discussions there about how we can really break the blockade and resume some of the oil shipments to ensure that Cuba has the energy that its basic infrastructure requires. So it's a very dynamic situation. It's dynamic both in the kind of maneuvers and in nightmarish plans and fantasies that some of the MAGA crew has for the recolonization of Cuba, but it's also dynamic in the sense of the response from other global South countries, indeed other sanctioned countries like Russia, for providing oil and ensuring that the economy continue to function on a day-to-day basis.
So just in closing then, David, the sympathy in this country, I think, is on your side as opposed to the notion of boots on the ground, which is a nightmarish notion, and particularly bombing the country. We already seeing what's happening in Iran, and it's hardly working out for anybody. So is there a possibility that what you're trying to do could inspire a broader movement of Americans, better angels, in terms of sending aid and help and doing what you can do through other channels as opposed to the government, in spite of the fact that there is this blockade?
Yeah.
So are there avenues to help you that are available?
I think there's a hopeful message here. I mean, I think, once again, whether it was Gaza and now indeed Cuba, we're seeing popular consciousness move faster than political representation. Partly that's due to social media. People are seeing for themselves the humanitarian consequences of our foreign policies live streamed onto their cell phones. And when the whole electricity grid goes out in Cuba because of this siege, people can see that it's the people who pay the price for this kind of form of economic warfare, as much as they want to talk about regimes and the need to substitute them. So I'm hopeful, especially in the Cuban case, that we can succeed to renovate the solidarity movements. There are people in their 60s, 70s who have rich memories of what the Cuban Revolution meant for their generation. But I'm hopeful that this convoy can help to educate a new generation about what Cuba has represented for the world, whether it's their medical internationalism or their biotech development, what they've represented for the anti-apartheid struggle and the Palestinian liberation, whatever it may be, and to switch them on to the real substantive ways that they can play a constructive role in the provision of much needed aid. And of course, the goal needs to be to model at a popular diplomatic level what we hope to see at a multilateral state diplomatic level. It still is the international legal obligation of like-minded countries who believe in international law to pick up the call of humanity and respond with serious provisions of petroleum and other critical resources to the Cuban people. But I think that our hope is that this convoy is a spark, as you say, for a much bigger popular movement at the grassroots in the United States to say, no blockade in our name. We don't support this policy. We don't understand its logic beyond the kind of anti-communist crusade aspects of it. And I think that what's exciting to see as well is a new generation of Cuban Americans, some of whom have never even been to the island, who are saying, wow, this is being done in my name, and supposedly for the liberation of my community. And that's a similar thing we saw with a lot of young Jewish Americans who were saying, wow, this genocide is being also conducted in my name for my safety. And I think that there's a relationship between these forms of very minoritarian captured foreign policy that we're trying to break out of and create a more humane, just, but ultimately democratic form of policy, foreign policy, that corresponds to people's actual underlying attitudes, views, and opinions about where our place and purpose in the world.
Well, David Adler, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Ian.
And I've been speaking with David Adler, who is in Mexico City, where he is the general coordinator for the Progressive International, who previously served as foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his campaign for the U.S. president, policy director for the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, and the co-founder of the Green New Deal for Europe campaign. He recently helped organize the global summit Flotilla to Gaza, leading to his arrest and detention in a prison camp in the Negev Desert by Israel. He's now organizing the Nuestra America convoy to Cuba, an international coalition delivering humanitarian aid by air, land, and sea to Havana, Cuba on March the 21st. We're going to take a brief station break and back exploring possible scenarios to end the US-Israel war on Iran, as well as the likelihood the war will escalate after Israeli strikes on a major Iranian gas field that could lead to reciprocal strikes against vulnerable Saudi, Qatari and other Gulf oil and gas terminals and storage facilities.
De Alto Cedro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Stephen Simon, who served on the National Security Council staff as Senior Director for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs, and also worked on the National Security staff on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. Currently a Senior Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a Distinguished Fellow at the Davidson Institute for Global Security and Professor of Political Science at Dartmouth College. He's the co-author, among other books, of The Age of Sacred Terror, and his latest book is Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East, and he has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Like Iraq, Key Intelligence Before Iran Strikes Was Ignored, as well as at War on the Rocks, Drinking from the Bitter Chalice in the Middle East Again. Welcome to Background Briefing, Stephen Simon.
Great to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us, Stephen. And I'm puzzled to know, of course, we had hearings today before the Senate Intelligence Committee where both Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard were grilled. And I must say, you know, the kakistocracy that we have running this government is so depressing that, you know, you just have to have some context here that these are so woefully unqualified people. But since you worked on the National Security Council staff for some time, there's no national security process anymore in this White House, is there?
Well, you know, each White House has a different, approach to, staffing, organizing, and relying on the NSC staff, that is, for different things and in different ways. In this administration, the NSC staff has been culled quite considerably after, I would say, 3 or 4 generations of growth, which had its own issues. But one thing you can be sure of is that there was, a large number of people who were capable of commenting on and evaluating and assessing policy proposals before they went up to the president and the National Security Advisor and the president for approval. In this case, some 54 individual positions were cut from the NSC staff. And typically, the NSC staff is drawn from U.S. government departments and agencies with a kind of a sprinkling of political appointees. In this case, the ratio of political appointees to detailees from government seems to be, unusually skewed, I suppose, in favor of political appointees or people who, are vetted to determine whether or not they are kind of on board with the president's policies, as against, being professional analysts and experts who lend that expertise and analytical skill to the evaluation of policy proposals. So there aren't many people there to do that. And the individual who is the National Security Advisor is also the Secretary of State. That's an arrangement that's not unprecedented. It does have one precedent in the form of Henry Kissinger many, many years ago. Almost a half a century ago, I guess. So that means that there's nobody at the NSC full-time who's managing the policy process. There's a deputy national security advisor who's allegedly doing that, but it doesn't seem as though the policy process is as orderly as systematic and methodical as it typically has been in previous administrations.
Well, what is so puzzling is that everybody that I've talked to since this war began, and I've tried to cast as wide a net as I possibly can to find out, and the question I keep asking is, can somebody tell me that this war is not an utter catastrophe? And so far, I haven't been able to find anybody that's been able to suggest that there's a possible light at the end of the tunnel here, that there's some kind of winning strategy underway. And the only winner that so far emerging, and this seems to be pretty much a consensus, is Vladimir Putin. And again, that gets you back to this crazy situation where, here's Putin, according to the Wall Street Journal, giving Iran targeting information, including satellite imagery, that may well have been responsible for the Iranian strike on the U.S. soldiers that were killed in Kuwait, where most of the casualties have happened so far, a lot of wounded. So here we are. This administration is going all out to help re-elect Orban in Hungary, who is Putin's guy, who's sabotaging NATO and denying funds for Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, which is being attacked by Russia, is trying to help the U.S. out in the Gulf by providing anti-drone technology. So this whole thing is sort of topsy-turvy. And when you talk about the functionality of the National Security Council, Steve Simon, one of the differences now with Trump is that he has these long conversations with Putin, and there's absolutely no record of what they talk about. It's always been the case where there's several people on the line taking notes, etc. And we, of course, recall in Trump's first administration, he got impeached over the fact that there were others on the line when he tried to shake down Zelensky to get dirt on Biden. So this is, to my mind, completely topsy-turvy, that we're at war. The only winner so far is Putin, and the people that we should be helping, like Ukraine, are getting hosed. None of it makes any sense.
Well, it does seem a bit perverse. I'm not at all surprised that the Russians have been supplying targeting data to the Iranians. It kind of makes sense for them to do it. We supply targeting data, for the Ukrainians to assist in their attacks on Russian installations. So we're getting a little bit of what we dish out from Putin. So I'm sure he finds it all very gratifying. It's worth it, though, for President Trump because, well, he has a serious problem in the Strait of Hormuz, which needs to be dealt with, and he needs some relief, and that relief has got to come in the form of additional energy resources coming onto the market, and those have got to come from Russia. I mean, there's no other producer with the swing capacity to make up that difference. So, despite the fact that the Russians are kind of putting a stick in American spokes out in the Gulf, Trump has no alternative really but to appeal to Putin for help. I mean, this war is making a lot of strange bedfellows, and this instance is probably the strangest. President Trump said the other day in a Truth Social statement, for example, that there are ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and they're Iranian vessels, and that the United States Navy is allowing Iran's vessels to transit Hormuz as a favor, quote unquote, to the world. Now, there's very little one come up with to explain these sorts of inconsistencies and quirks in a policy that's essentially being improvised, and it has to be improvised really because there is a war plan for Iran. It's been developed since the early 1990s. operational plan 1002, and then later on, a kind of an update and elaboration on that plan in the form of Tirant, which is the Theater Iran near-term plan, which has been updated, quite frequently. But these plans, or so it's reported anyway. These plans contemplated, I guess, what you'd think of as sort of a conventional escalation scenario. So the United States does X in furtherance of a particular interest. So let's say attacking Iranian nuclear sites. And then the Iranians respond. And then the United States responds to, Iran's retaliatory attacks. And things escalate to the point where, at the end of the day, the United States seeks out Iranian regime leaders to eliminate them, because that's sort of the top of the escalatory ladder. It's just removing the other guy's regime. In this case, the United States took that campaign plan and turned it on its head. So it started with where the war is supposed to end, namely with attacks on Iranian leadership, and thereby leaving no room for escalation, except, through attacks on the Iranian economy and the basis of its social cohesion. And that's one of those directions a campaign plan can take that has no obvious end, in part because you started off where you would normally stop, and in part because once you start going after the other guy's entire society and economy, well, Iran is a very large country, and it's got a large population, a large economy, and a well-established, deeply rooted society that's presided over by, a very powerful government that has all the guns. So, so if that's your escalation scenario, it's essentially open-ended. I mean, how do you really know that you've won until, of course, the country that you're attacking literally falls apart? Now, the Israelis, I think, would favor that kind of outcome. For the United States, it's not so clear, that having, a disintegrated country, especially such a large one, in an area is of such vital interest to the United States, is just, I don't know, that prospect baffles me, and I can't see that being, a reasonable war aim. But that does seem to be the war aim at this point.
Well, the escalation, though, is going in a direction that the U.S. and Trump apparently will not like. He's really concerned about the gas prices at the pump and how it's going to affect Republicans in the upcoming November elections. And they seem to have had some kind of arrangement with the Israelis that they weren't going to go after oil and gas targets because they didn't want the reciprocity to escalate up the ladder. And that's exactly what happened, right? The Israelis just bombed a big gas field in Iran. And previously, I believe after they'd bombed the oil terminals near Tehran and covered the city in a kind of black smoke, the U.S. discouraged Israel from doing those kind of attacks because it's easy for the Iranians to strike back at the Saudi, Qatari, and UAE fields. And then you really get into a long energy war where Russia again benefits. So it would seem to me that Putin would be perfectly happy for this war to go on forever. Trump, on the other hand, wants to get out from under endless wars. So aren't we heading into a much worse situation?
I'd have thought so. I mean, it's difficult to see how this how this thing winds down, despite the fact that it's yielding such counterintuitive results. I mean, attacking Iran's oil and gas infrastructure is just, falls into the category of the guy who likes roast beef. So he burns down his barn to get some. That's, not what, prudent people do. So no, I don't see really where this goes because, we're in a situation where, you have two major players, the United States and Iran, and they're in this battle, which is the outcome of which will depend on who can take pain more, who can take the greater amount of pain. And the Iranians, they've shown a serious capacity to absorb pain, and in fact, they've taken so much, and that it's really questionable whether it matters anymore how much additional pain is applied. The United States is only just beginning to experience, that pain, and arguably, the United States is more susceptible to the kind of economic pain that this war is inflicting and which will likely grow. There's been a new poll from that was sponsored by the Quincy Institute, the American Conservative magazine, and carried out by Ipsos, which purported to show that there were the beginnings of a split within the Republican electorate, on this vote. In fact, a split within MAGA, the Make America Great Again movement, those who were considered to be, most loyal to Trump. And, if those findings turn out to be a trend, over time, then the Republicans are indeed going to face a serious challenge, or even a greater challenge than they otherwise might have in November, posing the risk of Republican loss of the House and possibly even the Senate. So you do have Republicans who are very, very concerned about this. The president himself seems, I don't know, not consistently focused on it. We know his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, was the first to signal that this was a potential problem, because one of the things that you do see in the polls, and I've just looked at about a half a dozen polls since the fighting started, is that support among Republicans, which is overall still very strong for this war, had begun to drop as the price increases were felt at the pump, at the gas pump, and that price rise has been quite remarkable. It's been very swift, and typically these spikes die down after a bit. But if the war continues very much longer and the Strait of Hormuz, rather, remains closed, well, the prices at the pump will get kind of sticky, and they'll plateau at a much higher, equilibrium. And that's going to make a lot of voters unhappy. And, that includes Republicans.
So what's going on then with you? We get reports that the Gulf potentates are really upset that they spent so much money buying American equipment and bribing the Trump family with $2 billion for Jared, etc. MBS apparently is on the phone regularly talking to Trump, urging him to finish the job with Iran. What's the real story there? Do they, I get back to my initial question, Steve, which is there any scenario where the U.S.-Israel strategy will actually win?
Yeah. So I think, it behooves us to maintain an open mind. There is the possibility of a win if the regime fractures and or there is a popular revolt that causes it to fracture, or in a less dramatic vein, if the Iranian regime decides that actually they can't take any more pain and a continuation of the war would endanger the current regime's hold on power, So they then say to the U.S. And others, probably including Moscow as well, that they are prepared for a ceasefire, and that if the United States is going to stop shooting at them, they will stop shooting at the United States, and they're willing to take the first step. They're willing to act first and stop firing in expectation of U.S. reciprocity. And then in that scenario, Trump, says, "Aha, you see, we won. We forced them to stop shooting and to open up the Strait of Hormuz and to come to the table." So those are your three alternatives to defeat or just an impasse and frustration for the United States, along with increasing costs. Now, that last scenario depends entirely, really, on an Israeli-American coordination, because it's not enough in that scenario for the United States to respond to an Iranian ceasefire reciprocally and to say, okay, now we're going to stop shooting too. The Israelis have to stop shooting as well, which means that Trump, under that situation, has got to be able to, tell Benjamin Netanyahu that, the Israelis need to stand down. The war's got to end for them too, and it's got to end for them at the same time as it ends for the United States. My sense is, just based on historical experience, if Trump were to say that to Netanyahu, the Israelis would comply. And Netanyahu could say to his electorate, well, Trump made me do it. I had no choice. I was forced into a ceasefire here, but we can't go against the United States on this one. So he escapes political blame at home by displacing the blame onto the U.S. president, and things go forward. But there's also the possibility that the Israelis just say, no, we see the possibility to destroy, the Iranian state and just really, really wreck it. And the ceasefire that the United States is contemplating will short circuit a victory that could be much more sweeping and decisive than the one that the United States thinks it's getting by, forcing the Iranians to agree to a ceasefire at this point and reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, there are two problems with that scenario there, Steve. One is, of course, that the Iranian regime has already told the people not to go out on the streets, not that when bombs are dropping it's a particularly good idea to begin with, but any sign of any protest, they will shoot you down and consider you Israeli soldiers. So we know how ruthless this regime is. So I can't see any of the people, even if the majority, which I believe is the case, hates this regime. I don't see them being suicidal. And then on the other point is that as you kill the leaders, and in particular Larijani, for example, who is considered more pragmatic than the others, you end up with really hardcore guys. So as you knock off the leadership, and we don't even know what's going on with the son, Mushtaba. He's supposedly in the ICU. He may be really gravely wounded, but he's certainly an indication that things could get worse in terms of hardcore leadership. So isn't that those two factors would indicate that we have some problems with that scenario?
Yeah, I guess I agree. I mean, I think that these scenarios that I've sketched out, including this one that would appear to be favorable to the United States and possibly Israel, depending upon how they construe, their interests. I think these scenarios are kind of unlikely. This is a regime that was already committed to staying in power, and they demonstrated that, pretty forcibly. They're not prepared to just leave. And, one of the reasons that the security services are going to stick by them, and here, the studies that have been done of the Arab Spring, have yielded interesting, insights. If the security forces in Iran are dependent on the regime because they know that if the regime goes down, they do too. And that's a huge incentive, to fight for the regime, until the bitter end, as happened, for example, in Syria, where, Assad supporters and his security services fought for that regime until the bitter end because they understood, or at least they perceived their future literally as hinging on the future of the regime. And I think there's much the same case in Iran. So I don't see the security services cracking or going over to the side of the people, whatever that might mean. I think they're gonna stick it out. The hope that the regime does fracture or just implode under the pressure of these air attacks, I don't I don't think that's very plausible. I don't think that's a more likely outcome than one in which Iran becomes tougher and more resistant to pressure, over time.
Right, but if you look at the Israeli scenario that you sketched out, which is just to have the place disintegrate and fall apart like Syria in a way, and there's a difference between Trump wanting, via MBS, wanting to prop up al-Shara, and the Israelis thinking that the leopard hasn't changed his spots. There's a difference there, and that may apply to Iran as well, as you made clear earlier, Steve, that so if you follow the Israeli scenario of just destroying the country and weakening it, then you have some real nightmares in that neighborhood, don't you? Not to mention the 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. God knows where that will end up.
Well, I think, Israel's calculation, and this is just an inference, I don't have any privileged, information on this score, obviously. From their perspective, is if Iran is really wrecked, then even its, residual possession of 60% enriched uranium, that might be enough for 8 or 10 bombs if it were further enriched and deployable and all that. I just don't think that they believe that the nuclear piece of this is going to be really dangerous, because the more fragmented Iran is, the easier it is to penetrate. The Israelis probably calculate that under those circumstances, they could find that stuff and remove it from Iran. I don't think that they're, really disconcerted about that. From an American perspective, thinking historically, particularly, for example, with regard to the chemical weapons that existed in Syria during the Assad regime, there was a serious fear that if there was chaos enveloping Syria, that its stocks of chemical weapons would be privatized. They'd be stolen, sold, distributed to the highest bidder, to warlords, terrorists, or whatnot, and what the result would be an unimaginable nightmare, especially for the peoples of the region, let alone the people of Syria itself. That I don't think that that's a concern of Israel's with respect to the fissile material that's still, somewhere in Iran, that we're discussing. I think they think that they eventually get their hands on it, and they'll get their hands on it before it's put to any nefarious use.
Well, just in the last couple of minutes then, Stephen Simon, let's try and, I say end on a positive note. There is no positive note, but let's go back to the scenario where Trump declares victory and the Iranians come up with some kind of a ceasefire offer to alleviate the pain. Would that be along the model of what the US did with Venezuela? In other words, you get rid of, they've already gotten rid of the leadership, except for the son, Moshtaba. We don't know what his fate is, but essentially you keep the same regime in place and just get rid of the top layer. Is that likely to happen? Is that, because obviously the pressure on Trump to declare victory is intensifying, and he's a reality TV guy. He needs a happy ending here.
Yeah, I think for him, a happy ending is the reopening of Hormuz, of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, that's in effect a problem that his attacks brought about. So he'd be extinguishing the fire that he started, in a way. But I could well see President Trump declaring victory on that basis and doing so credibly, at least with respect to his base. And certainly the markets will be, very pleased that the strait has been reopened, and if he can create some sort of durable arrangement to ensure that the strait would be reopened, and not just temporarily until the next crisis, but just really a passage that international commerce and oil shippers could go back to relying on. For the long haul, I think that would really stand him in good stead. But he needs the Iranians to cooperate in that. And here I think there's a role for the Russians, because they clearly are in a position to mediate. You have Iran, the United States. They're very far apart right now, but the leaders of both sides would require a substantial amount of political cover, to make concessions leading to a ceasefire. So I think you need a mediator that will supply the two sides with the necessary cover, and the Russians are in a position to do that. And Putin would love to do it, I'm sure, to be, the peacemaker, as it were, in the Gulf. The Russians have long sought a key role in the Gulf, and this would confer it on them. And he'd have the everlasting goodwill of both Trump and the regime in Tehran. So I think, there's a diplomatic game plan that experts could probably whip up in about 15 minutes that involves a mediating role, particularly one played by Russia, that would allow the parties to back off and a kind of a period of stability ensue. But right now, the parties are so far apart that they're not close enough to choosing the mediator.
Right, and
who will give them the political cover.
And if striking oil and gas fields and depots on both sides of the Gulf escalate, then that becomes a whole different scenario where China, Japan, South Korea, and the NATO countries are the losers and Russia's the winner. So I appreciate your time here today, Stephen, and thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot.
And I've been speaking with Stephen Simon, who served on the National Security Staff as Senior Director for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs. He also worked on the NSC staff on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. Currently, he's a Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a Distinguished Fellow at the Davison Institute for Global Security and a Professor of Political Science at Dartmouth College. He's also the author of The Age of Sacred Terror and Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. And he has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Like Iraq, Key Intelligence Before Iran Strikes Was Ignored, as well as At War on the Rocks, Drinking from the Bitter Chalice in the Middle East Again. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org. where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
By 9:30, who'll ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice singing something to me. An angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. A teacher and the other became a car. A car skidded into the rain, making the last little one to say, one more light goes out in the